Boris Johnson was an abject failure as Prime Minister, according to a Reform MP who says his party can form the next government and don't need his help to do it. Rupert Lowe said he would not want Mr. Johnson in the Reform ranks if the former Tory leader attempts to make a comeback. He said, "He's had a play with the toy set and he singularly failed." Mr. Lowe, who took Great Yarmouth from the Conservatives at the last election, also pushed back at the possibility of a Tory Reform link-up ahead of the next election. He pointed to how then Brexit Party leader Nigel Farage stood down candidates in Tory-held seats in 2019, helping pave the way for Mr. Johnson's landslide win. He said, "Nigel stood down in all the Tory seats last time and gave Boris an 80-seat majority. Tell me what he did with it. He didn't even do Brexit well. We had the Northern Ireland Protocol, so we got most of Britain out, but we left a leg in the wretched socialist empire in Europe." Mr. Lowe said he did not dream of Mr. Johnson, who was a pivotal figure in the 2016 Vote Leave campaign, quitting the Tories to join Reform. He said, "Boris, I think, was an abject failure. It is certainly not my dream. No, I think it is extraordinary that Boris is still in the betting to be the next Prime Minister. It's bizarre." He acknowledged this would be a matter for party leader Mr. Farage but said, "Would we want him? I certainly wouldn't." His comments come as concern mounts in Tory circles about the threat of Reform splitting the centre-right vote. In the summer election, the Tories won 6,828,925 votes and 121 seats, while Reform took 4,117,610 votes and 5 constituencies. Mr. Johnson has been invited to comment. Here is a summary of internet users' reactions. No, he was not. Boris knew that leaving the EU would trash our economy. And all political parties follow the mantra, originally put forwards by Paul Smith of the Institute for Fiscal Studies many years ago: grow your economy by growing your population, by immigration. If we had more babies we wouldn't need to do this, but we don't. We have a very low birth rate, so this article is wrong in every respect. Boris also had the pandemic to deal with. He got the vaccine sorted out. He had, like all other nations did, to lock down to slow down the rate of infection. He did all this and he got COVID himself and nearly died. And don't say he wasn't at risk of death, because I know the 2 St. Thomas Hospital consultants who treated Boris. If only the Daily Express could get better journalists, perhaps their content would be worth reading. And BTW, Boris Johnson is the best leader since Thatcher. I completely disagree with Lowe. I've just finished reading Unleashed, Boris Johnson's 700-page book, detailing his period of being PM. He got all the big calls right, except perhaps allowing Rishi Sunak too much freedom with dishing money out to everyone, but he does acknowledge mistakes. It was an impossible job to get exactly right, trying to combat an unknown disease that swept the world. Read it and you might get a different view. He did a great deal of good work. Boris Johnson would have no need to make a comeback by joining Reform. I'm sure that the Conservatives members would welcome him back. BJ was an excellent PM until he was subjected to a political assassination. He had more to deal with than any PM in living memory: Brexit, the pandemic, Russia/Ukraine war, and the cruel onslaught of inscrutable people who pushed him out of his job, the media playing a big part. Boris was a man of the people. He had his finger on the pulse of the UK and listened to and cared about public opinion, unlike the present PM who has no regard for the public or the UK. We don't have to guess if BJ is a competent politician. We have seen him work, and all but the blind must appreciate all that he did for the UK. He worked for the country he loves and its people. At present folk may be being fooled by Reform, but in my opinion it will not last, as they are too big a risk, being totally inexperienced. Boris, who failed to deliver a proper Brexit, who was the architect of net zero, who stated, "Over my dead body would there be a border down the Irish Sea." What do we have? Yes, a border down the Irish Sea and Northern Ireland sacrificed to the EU. Immigration, which he said would be reduced, reached record numbers. Lowe is correct, Reform will do well without him. Ironically, his "we are more equal than others" stance saved us from far longer lockdowns. At the time he was caught, Labour were pushing for more lockdowns and restrictions on freedoms, with the Tories mostly in support, too. Once Boris was caught, even Labour knew it would be impossible to ask us and just us to keep respecting the rules. I seem to remember it was barely days after he was done that suddenly, from nowhere, these restrictions necessary to save you all were lifted on a whim. And whereas you yesterday would risk jail for going to work with COVID, now you were encouraged to do exactly that. Whatever Lowe thinks is irrelevant. He has no concept of the pressures of running a country in COVID, which Boris did well, and Reform have no answers to the sabotage by establishment, which is what caused Boris problems. What Lowe has done is alienated Boris voters, who now fit in neither party. I think reading Boris' autobiography before commenting on him should be mandatory reading, since most of the commenters know nothing about him. They have a false caricature derived from media who care nothing for truth. I do. I spent a long time talking to him at the Institute of Directors with a TV dragon friend. Boris is not who the haters portray him as. Well, Mr. Lowe, what have you actually achieved as a politician? Nigel Farage is the driving force behind Reform, along with a couple of others. Your name hardly registers with most voters. Yes, Boris made some mistakes, which led to his resignation. But he did achieve a form of Brexit, for good or bad, and took this country through one of the most difficult situations since World War II, which was COVID. You can also argue that Boris was given a bad hand for many reasons, but that doesn't matter with regard to the future. He is now the past, and if Reform are to succeed, they are best having no links to that past if they are to retain the claim of change. Boris will undermine that, and whilst he is a great campaigner and will bring votes with him, he is just as likely to alienate just as many. There is no gain to Reform, nor is there a gain for Boris, as even if successful, Farage, Tyser etc. are not going to let him waltz back into No 10. Everyone is better moving on. UK will leave European single market. This agreement should allow for the freest possible trade in goods and services between Britain and the EU's member states. But I want to be clear, what I am proposing cannot mean membership of the single market. Not seeking partial or associate membership. We seek a new and equal partnership between an independent, self-governing, global Britain and our friends and allies in the EU. Not partial membership of the European Union, associate membership of the European Union, or anything that leaves us half in, half out. We do not seek to adopt a model already enjoyed by other countries. We do not seek to hold on to bits of membership as we leave. No. The United Kingdom is leaving the European Union, and my job is to get the right deal for Britain as we do. We'll no longer contribute huge sums to EU budget. Because we will no longer be members of the single market, we will no longer be required to contribute huge sums to the EU budget. There may be some specific EU programs we might want to participate in. The days of Britain making vast contributions to the European Union will end. No deal better than bad deal. While I am sure a positive agreement can be reached, I am equally clear that no deal for Britain is better than a bad deal for Britain. Theresa May 17/1/17. Then she gave away the kitchen sink for nothing in return. I do like Boris, but think he let us down over Brexit, which was never completed properly. Also, he did nothing to stop mass immigration, legal and illegal, which is one of the main reasons we now have this dreadful Labour government who seem incapable of doing anything that benefits the British people and our way of life. That's a little unfair on Boris Johnson really. He was basically cleaning up the mess that Theresa May, avid Remainer, had left him, but as in saying that, I don't think he should join Reform anyway, as I don't think Terry's enough room for two big egos in him and Nigel Farage anyway. The only way to make room would be to tell him that he'll never be running Reform, and to accept it, and I don't think he'll do that.